Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the Real Life Practice Podcast. I'm Teresa McCloy.
And I'm Lindsay Sturkey, and we are excited to welcome you into our conversation about what it means to practice our faith in our ordinary, everyday life. In each season of the podcast, we'll explore a different spiritual practice together that will help us connect with God and become more of who He has created us to be.
We'll talk about spiritual growth. We'll explore our life story and discover how to pay attention to God in the ordinary and extraordinary moments of our day. And in this season is about the practice of retreat and how the invitation to get away and create space for connection with God is so important in our lives. So, welcome to the conversation. Lindsay, I'm excited to dive into this particular conversation. I know for you and I both, retreats have been such a huge part of our spiritual journey, our ability to just hold it together in so many ways in life. And we'll talk more about that actually in the next episode, just for you and I and our own personal journeys. But let's dive in before we go there and set up this series, as in just what are we talking about when we say retreat? It's not a vacation necessarily, although it can feel good and renewing for our bodies and our minds. But what are we really talking about when we say the word retreat in a spiritual practice sense?
I think it's so important to define our term because, like you said, we might have different things that come to mind for us of what we think of when we talk about retreat. Because even if you just take the word at face value, I think of getting away and getting away from life or stress or whatever it is could be just an escape or a way to check out. But the difference to me of a spiritual retreat is that we are getting away in order to be with God. And so it's not really a disconnection, it's a choosing to lean in with the source of life. So when we talk about retreat, we are talking about getting away for the purpose of being with God.
So, one of our favorite quotes that we often, and one of our favorite authors is actually Dallas Willard. And Dallas has a great quote that I think just sets up why. Why would we go on retreat? Why would we set aside this time? And the quote from Dallas Willard says, "If you don't come apart for a while, you will come apart after a while." And such a play on words, but what a beautiful way of just saying this set aside time to come apart for a while keeps us from coming apart, especially in the culture and the pace that we live in now. And you hear a lot of buzz around this idea of the pace of life and culture and all the social stuff that's going on and just the inundation of information and all of this. And this quote really says that if you don't step away from that, it is something that will tear you apart mentally, physically, emotionally, the head, heart, body connection we often talk about. So I just love how he says that, the importance of, and we see that modeled right in scripture. It's modeled by Jesus in so many places in scripture of he went away. Whether he was on the boat, on the mountain, going into the garden, whatever it might be, he got away for a while.
And I think if Jesus needed to get away for a while,
Must be
how much
important.
more do we need to get away for a
Right.
while? If it was necessary for him, I don't know about you, but I think I might need it,
I think
especially.
we might need it for sure. So it is important when we look at scripture for these spiritual practices to say, where do we see it? Where do we see it showing up in both the Old and the New Testament? So many times when someone was having a deep spiritual experience, the whole book of Psalms, as David writes, many times, Elijah, all these people that we see, these characters in the Bible that we've studied and then we followed, some of their deepest spiritual growth happened when they were away. Going back to one of the practices we talked about, silence and solitude. Many times to get silence and solitude, you have to go away for a while. Let's set it up
Absolutely.
just a little bit more. What are some more definitions that we might be able to give around this before we dive in?
One of our favorite writers about spiritual practices is Adele Calhoun. If you've listened to this podcast before, you've heard us reference the Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. And in this book, she takes each practice and defines it and gives examples. It's a great resource if you haven't checked that out. But she talks about retreat as being a practice of pulling back from daily life and spending extended time with God. And I think for me, what stands out with that is that it's away from daily life. So you are getting out of the normal routines of your day, probably getting into a new environment is often part of retreat, and you're spending extended time with God. So this is different than that daily practice of time with God. This is going to be for a longer period of time. Now, it might be a matter of hours, it might be days. There's not one way that this looks, but I think that key element is that it is longer than your typical daily rhythm.
I think that's a great way to say it. I know recently you had shared with me as part of your spiritual direction training, just in the last month or so, I think you were invited as part of that training to spend like a half a day. That doesn't sound, oh, why would a half a day make that much difference or be that important? And yet I know you even wrote about it, I think maybe in one of your blogs, but what just saying 3 to 4, maybe 5 hours, a half a day might be in a retreat.
Yeah. And I think it's always amazing to me how even that amount of time, even half a day, was so impactful for me. And I think it's because I was intentional about blocking the time on my calendar. I let a few key people know, hey, I'm going to be off the grid for this part of the day. I put my phone on do not disturb. I went to a nature preserve that's only about 20 minutes from my house, but it was enough of a shift in my environment that my body and my soul felt that difference. And
Mm.
so being out, I walked the paths, I would sit down on the benches and I would pray, I would journal, I would just look off into the trees and just be with God. But having that set aside time in the middle of my week that felt different was so impactful because I think we all want to go off for several days in a cabin in the woods, but that's not always realistic. It's great when we can do that kind of thing. But I think we can be creative in finding even just a smaller block of time in our week that even going somewhere local can feel like we're getting away because it's out of our everyday routine.
Before we go deep into this series, and we're going to do several episodes on retreats, we've got some guests coming up that actually run silent retreats and do some retreat work. Before we go down the path too far, I wanted people to hear, if you're listening, that, okay, I don't have time to do 2 or 3 days away. We're not talking always about it being 2 or 3 days. I think you mentioned some important things: intentionality, pre-deciding when you're going to go. One of the things I would invite people to, as you listen through this series, is look ahead, look in the next 6 months or 9 months, and maybe even a whole year, and say, how often, when would I like to? What would it look like? Would there be a couple of half a days? Would there be some longer times? So what else does Adele say? Because I love her definitions about retreat, and she's got some really good phrases and ways for us to look at it.
She also says that they are times for quietly listening to God and delighting in his company.
Mm.
I especially love that part about delighting in his company because sometimes we think a retreat, we go into it with our same productive accomplishment mindset of I'm going to get something out of this. I'm going to walk away with answers and clarity. And really, it's an invitation to simply be with God and know that He wants to be with us and delights in our presence, and we can delight in His presence. And to me, that's such a freeing thing. I know even when I went on my half day retreat, I had to let go of that expectation that it was going to be a certain way or that I had to get something out of it, that it was enough to simply be in God's presence during the retreat time.
And she mentions another word that I lean into a lot when I think about time with, it's withdrawing. I am a very forward moving type. And so that invitation to withdraw comes in so many ways. Let me just walk through this, even because there's an invitation to withdraw maybe on a daily basis. Maybe you get that 15 to 30-minute time in the morning or in the evening, or maybe you go sit in your car at lunch or whatever that might be. So there is a small withdrawal that we're invited to on a daily basis. And then hopefully there's a larger weekly withdrawal as we practice Sabbath, and just that time that we might spend in worship with our church community, and maybe the time that we come home and we have some family time, or we've shut our mind down to some of those types of things for more of an extended period of time of 6 to 8 hours, whatever that might be. And then we add in these times, these beautiful retreat times that are maybe just a little bit longer, but they feel different. They're that withdrawal piece. Every one of us has a need to withdraw. Doesn't matter how we're wired, what our personality's like. It's learning to lean into that give and flow. And then there's the even bigger retreat that I was privileged to take here not too long ago, of a sabbatical. But when you hear those, the small daily, the weekly Sabbath, I think God is a God who has rhythms to what he creates in us, and ways that we can lean in at little tiny places that he meets us, and then these bigger ways. And so when you think of this word retreat, there are lots of invitations. Maybe you're just still leaning into the daily little times. This is just another way to lean in that way. So I love that word, withdrawing.
I think that's so important to think about, like you said, the different rhythms and how we can incorporate that. And I think if we are not in the practice of daily withdrawing, then when we do get a block of time for retreat, it might be harder to settle into it because we're not in the practice. It's like we've allowed all of these things going on in our minds and in our lives and our souls to build, and there hasn't been a space to release those. If that happens to you, if you go on retreat and it's been a while since you've slowed down, be gentle with yourself, give yourself grace, but
Right.
don't be surprised if it's hard to settle into the space. The more that you practice this, the more that you withdraw, like you said, daily, weekly, quarterly, whatever that looks like, the more you'll be able to settle into that space. And I think, again, it's going into it with the expectation that all we are doing is spending time in the presence of God, that we don't have to get some big word or result from it. But that being said, there are times that you go on retreat and there is something specific God has for you. And so building these regular times of retreat creates space to hear from God. We say we want to hear from God. We want to know his voice. We want to know what he is inviting us to do in our lives. And so as we create this space, often there are things that come out of this time. Again, we come not demanding that, but open to what God might have for us in that time.
And I think it's so many other things. It is going in and going, okay, I don't have an expectation. Probably what will happen is after retreat, like you'll reflect back and you'll remember maybe a prayer that you prayed, or something that you read if you took something to read with you, or just a time that you did feel like, oh, God was sharing something with me. And now I see what that was and what that invitation was. So this idea that we build upon and we practice, but don't not go on retreat, or don't not think about these things. I think that's probably a double negative. Don't not, but because you're like, I haven't done enough to be ready, or I haven't prepared. Those are some of the times that are the sweetest, that we need it the most. One of the invitations that I heard early on from a mentor, a spiritual mentor, Ruth Haley Barton of mine, when I was in the Transforming Center, was, if you come, and it was a retreat setting, if you come and you need a nap, take a nap the entire time. That was life-changing for me 15 years ago, was somebody gave me permission to take a nap and say it was okay. And the older I get, the more I lean into that invitation to lay down for 20 minutes or 2 hours if needed. So if you go on retreat and you have that luxury, even if it's just a half a day, to rest your body, retreat is an invitation to rest. So as we move into this series, Lindsay, why don't you share with us just where we see this series going? We'll have 6 episodes or so, as we've done in the past, of just diving in at a little bit deeper in our conversations. And this is just an introductory to say, hey, here's a new word maybe you haven't even heard of, or you've heard of it, but you haven't explored it from a spiritual nature. Where do we see taking this? We don't know everywhere the conversation will go, but yeah, what's the invitation as we lean into this series?
We would really love to give you both the why behind retreat, but also some practical ideas of how you
Always.
can do this. We always want to bring in the practical. And so in the next episode, Teresa and I will share some of our own experience of retreat, of just how that's looked in our life and through our story and in different seasons of life, I think is huge because it looks different depending on what season and stage of life that you're in. We'll also talk about environments for retreat. What are the different places that you might go? We'll talk about why we might resist retreat. Why do we avoid it sometimes, even though it's something that we feel drawn to, yet there's also some resistance there. What do you actually do when you get on retreat? We have just a few suggestions of things that you can engage in that will help you be open to God during the time. There's not one right way to do it. There's not a wrong way to do it, but there are some ideas that could get you started as you go on retreat. We have, like Teresa said, some guests that are going to come on that lead retreats for others that are going to share from their experience and what that looks like in community, even doing retreat where there's portions alone, but there's also time together in community. So those are just a few things we want to talk about because, again, we want to give you some tools and resources for how you can actually practice this in your life, no matter what stage or season you're in, however much or little time that you have to block for retreat. There's a next step for you.
And we'll also create, as we do with each and every series, we will have a downloadable resource for you. So you can get that link in the show notes as well. But Lindsay, do we have a title yet for that resource, or no? Will probably be called the realifeprocess.com/retreats is probably what I would guess that it is, but make sure you click in the show notes and then we'll announce that on each of the podcast episodes. We always want to give you just a tangible resource that you can look at and say, oh, this is more of what we've talked about on the podcast. So we'll have that for you as well. We always want to invite you into community with us. And one of the easiest ways to be in community and conversation with Lindsay and myself and others that are walking in these types of journeys is actually to go to our website at therealifeprocess.com and click on the community tab up at the top. And when you do, it will invite you onto another platform called the Circle platform. You just log in, put your email and password, create a password there, and you can now be in community with others who are practicing these things. And that's just a great place to go. Oh, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. Sometimes when we're in our local communities, we can feel like, does anybody else have this desire? Does anybody else have this longing? You can also get lots of resources there from our past podcasts and other things. So we just invite you to connect with us there. It's off of social media. So if you're trying to avoid as much into the social platforms as you can, this is a private platform that you can be on and be there as much or as little as you'd like.
We just want to make sure we invite you to check out our YouTube channel. We have a playlist just for this podcast that if you prefer video or if that's where you find your content, we're on YouTube. Also want to make sure you know that our Real Life Practice membership is always open for you to join, but this is an especially good time because starting in July, we are beginning a new book called Journey of the Soul. And this is about stages of faith and what that looks like in different parts of your life. So even as we talk about retreat and how we engage with that in different stages, this book talks about how we grow over time and what that looks like in each part of our walk with God. We have a couple live calls per month. We have a ton of resources there, all kinds of ways you can connect with other people who are looking to grow with God in their everyday life. So you can check that out in the show notes as well, but especially wanted to mention it with a new book starting because that's always a fun time to jump in.
Sybil Towner and Lindsay lead that call every month that's around the book discussion. And Lindsay and myself lead another call every month that's just around tools like this. The podcast is our free resource. And then we have our membership that gives you some additional resources, some deeper connections, some community, and a couple of live calls. They are live, but they're recorded as well. We have a lot of people that aren't able to come on live, but they love listening to those recordings and that invitation to dive a little bit deeper. So all of that can be found in the show notes. This is our third series in this podcast series that we have done. So if you like these little series, you can go back and listen. We have done one on silence and solitude. We have done another podcast series on journaling. That was one of my favorites we did at the beginning of the year. And now we're diving into retreat. So these will always just be short little resources you can share out with a friend. If you're like, hey, I found this podcast that is talking about these different ways to practice some of these things in your life that give you some stability and ways to be away, as Dallas Willard says, apart for a while, share it out with a friend. That's the biggest compliment you can pay us, is to share the podcast with someone else.
We're excited to continue exploring this practice of retreat with you. So thank you so much for listening today. We hope that you will join us next time as we continue to listen to Jesus' invitation to learn the unforced rhythms of grace in our everyday, ordinary life. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.